All right, today I am seriously going to ask you the question, is Danny Ainge the most masculine man in America? To tee that up, let me take you to April 24th, 1983, one of the most famous brawls in NBA history. Here it is. It's in the playoffs. Tree Rollins is underneath there, gets a dunk. Now watch, here comes. Bam. That's it. Larry Bird underneath there. Kevin McHale up top. They're all getting pulled apart. This goes on for like a couple minutes, in which Tree Rollins is on top of Danny Ainge. Danny Ainge gets ejected.
Whether or not it's by injury or whether it's because he's been escalated remains to be seen.
Turns out it was both.
Very surprised that Tree Rollins was not ejected along with Danny Ainge.
Nope, Tree Rollins does not get ejected. Now here goes slow motion. Watch this.
Here's how it started.
Get the elbow up.
The round field flying on the floor. Look at the elbow there.
Watch Danny Ainge. This is the best.
And now Ainge will tackle Rollins. Watch this. Well, he was smart to go in low because Tree was going to throw a haymaker in there. He had to get him down.
Yes, he did.
Danny Ainge, baseball, basketball, looks like a nice open field.
Okay. All right. That's one of my favorite things ever. And it does not answer the question, is Danny Ainge the most masculine man in America? But it sure gets the conversation started, doesn't it? So, hi, I'm James McQuivy. I am doing a New Year's resolution that I call the Year of Living Manly. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you might want to check out the intro video, but you don't need to follow along in this video. Basically, I am here to admit that I have been missing out on some of the benefits of being more masculine. Follow all the links to read all the details, but basically, masculine men have it better and they do more for other people and for the community. Now, whose definition of masculine? Well, that's the core issue. I had decided to approach this the way a nerd researcher does. I actually surveyed 1,500 U.S. adults. I surveyed nearly 800 men in the United States in March of 2021, and I asked them a whole bunch of things about their lives, without telling them that I was going to figure it out what the connection between their masculinity and those things in their lives were. Then I also asked them, by the way, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you agree with the following statement? I consider myself very masculine. Now, in just piecing out the people who said 5 out of 5, I consider myself very masculine, 41% of men check that box. And those 41% of men, the very masculine, strongly agree that they are very masculine. These are different men than the rest of us, a confessed solid 4. Anyway, all that detail is in the prior videos and is in later videos, but let's get back to the key question here. Is Danny Ainge the most masculine man in America? So the reason I'm introducing this is, first of all, I love this moment in history. I'm a Boston guy now, but back then I wasn't. In 1983, I was barely in high school, but I had actually been following Danny Ainge's career since he was in college. Now, if you don't know, Danny Ainge recently retired, as in last year, from the Boston Celtics, where he was general manager. That was his first NBA team out of college, and then he played for the Phoenix Suns and did a bunch of other coaching and all this stuff. Came back to Boston, 10 years ago. Coached here, managed to win a championship. I mean, the Celtics are pretty awesome, and Ainge has been an important part of the Celtics. So, of course, we love Danny Ainge here in Boston. But I've been following him since he was in college, and I'm going to tell you, Danny Ainge was always understood as just a hothead. When we would watch Danny play in college and then later in pro, you just always, it's like you could watch the temperature rise in his face as he starts to get redder and redder and his eyes get more focused, and you think, okay, watch this guy because he's good, but he's even better when he's mad, and he seemed to get mad a lot. So in 1983, he's been playing for the Celtics now for 2 years. He came in right after the Celtics had won a championship, an NBA championship, and he's a young guy trying to prove himself, and he's playing really, really well. But it's 1983. They are now entering the playoffs. They're playing against Atlanta, and in Atlanta, they're up against a really formidable opponent. Now, Tree Rollins, Danny Ainge, just for context, not a tall guy. He is about 6'5", depending on which roster you believe from his pro days. And Tree Rollins, on the other hand, 7'1", 250 pounds. Tree was known and had been fined actually that year for throwing his elbows around a lot. Look, the NBA it's not preschool. They don't keep all the rules. They're very aggressive with each other, both verbally and under the net when the refs aren't looking right. But that's the way the game was played, and both of these men were very good at that style of play. But Tree has 7 feet 1 inch, 250 pounds behind him, whereas Danny does not. So anyway, what happens is from the very beginning of the game, they start razzing each other. There's a little bit of pushing and shoving, and at one point off camera is caught Danny shoving back on Tree, and then there's some dispute over who said what first and who shoved whom first. Anyway, what happens is what you just saw, that moment in the game where Rollins gets an amazing dunk and then comes out of it, and for whatever reason, now I've never heard his account of this. I read news accounts from the New York Times actually covered this. That's how big a deal this was. I read news accounts where he said, I saw Danny getting his fist ready to hit me. But you saw the video. You saw it's really Tree seeing Danny and being like, my elbow just happens to be right here. If I accidentally clip him. Now, if you're watching Danny Ainge and you know how he plays, you know that Danny's thinking like, okay, I'm going to move my head to make sure I get that elbow in the face. I mean, I'm making that psychology up, but it sure seemed like he knew it was coming and he got ready for it. Now, if you listen to the commentary on this, you get all these opinions about, if you're Danny, you can't let Tree, who's got more experience in the league, has been playing for a few years more than you, and he's big and strong, and you can't let him intimidate you, right? So we're getting this classic masculine, like, tough guy. Well, I'm going to be tougher than you. But in the end, if Danny Ainge ends up going up against Tree Rollins, he's going to lose physically, just purely physically. So if you're Danny Ainge, you gotta pick your moment. And okay, I'll let the cat out of the bag here. I actually have heard Danny discuss in a group of about 6 men this event, because I got to tell you, if you ever have the chance to corner Danny Ainge, as I've seen a few people do, you're going to hear people ask him questions about key moments in his career, and this is one of them that I think he's so tired of telling this story, but I still heard him tell it with a grin on his face. So he says, look, everybody knew about Tree. And everybody knew that if you don't stand up to him early in a game, he's going to just push you around all game long. And this is the playoffs now. They were 1-1. So at that point in the playoffs, Boston had 1-1 in the Boston Garden. You saw that famous parquet floor. Then they lost one in Atlanta, and they were coming back. So it's a best of 3. Look, listen to me talk like I know sports. I don't know anything about sports, which is I'll confess in other videos later. But so anyway, if they win this game in Boston in front of the home crowd, they go on to play Milwaukee for the conference finals, which, spoiler alert, they end up losing. Unfortunately, it's a best of 7. They lose all 4 games in a row. Unfortunately, they have to wait another year, the Celtics do, before they finally take the 1984 NBA championships, which is, very cool. And Danny Ainge was there, and it's really nice. All right, fine. But what happens, according to Danny, now I've never heard Tree's version of this story, so I'll just say I'm hearing it from Danny's side. Danny says that he just knew early on he's going to have to stand up to Tree at some point, but he needed to pick his moment. He needed to wait until Tree did something that was so obviously beyond the pale that he would have to come back at him. And the situation presented itself. So, you saw in there, Tree comes up with his elbow, and, Ainge probably could have ducked it, but he didn't. He didn't move into it for sure, but he stood his ground. And the commentators later make that point that because they watch it from all these different angles. He stood his ground. He gets hit in the face with an elbow. And then it's really clear it is on. These 2 men, hyper masculine, they're going to go after each other, right? And they do. And then, of course, here's the story from Danny's point. Danny says, look, I know I'm going to lose if I take this guy on, mano a mano. And so I have to use my only advantage, which is to undercut his height. And he did. You saw he just dives right in. That's why I grabbed that in a screenshot. Comes in low, gets him on the ground, basically makes sure that his longer reach can't do anything with a punch. Because really, at that point in the playoffs, you do not want to get not only ejected, which he did, but you don't want to get knocked out so you don't get to play the rest of the postseason. So at that point, Danny just figures, I'm going to get kicked out of this game. but I need to make sure that Tree knows he's not going to mess with me or my team in front of the home crowd. So he goes in low, tackles him, knocks him to the ground, and in the melee, this is the most famous part about it. This is, I think, why the New York Times wrote so much about it. Tree actually bites Danny's finger, middle finger, I think it was. And Danny has to go to the hospital and get 5 stitches. So it turns out to be a big deal. I mean, Tree doesn't actually get kicked out of the game. They didn't look at the replay to see that he really was the instigator. From what the refs saw, it looked like Danny just tackled him out of nowhere. And so Tree plays nearly the rest of the game. It's not until the fourth quarter that he finally fouls out. And he gets, of course, booed out by the Boston crowd. And, he wasn't a fan favorite at that point. Let's just put it that way. So anyway, the question is still, is Danny Ainge the most masculine man in America? And what I don't mean by that is how cool is he that he could take out Tree Rollins? Because, all respect for Tree, I have no idea how he perceived that game or whatever. But if all we're doing is trying to figure out who can beat up the other guy, that's not actually the question of who's more masculine. This is where I want to tell you the rest of the story, to borrow that old phrase. So Danny Ainge is a different guy than maybe you would expect. Yeah, hot-headed, super high performer. Went with the Celtics to several national championships in later seasons, as I indicated. But what's interesting is that when Danny was back here in Boston, would do the talk radio shows all the time. One time he had this opportunity. They started asking him about his long career and some of his buddies over the years and where they all were. And the conversation got kind of serious. The conversation got into, what about the life outcomes of some of your friends? And Danny's like, look, I love these guys. I've played with them in all these different teams, and I've been their opponent in some cases. I've been their teammates in others. I love these guys. I'm not going to speak bad of them. But let me just tell you that when I would play a game, we'd exert ourselves, go to the locker rooms, win or lose, shower, whatever. The other guys would say, hey, Danny, let's go to a strip club. Hey, Danny, I know this bar we can go to. This will be great. And Danny would always say, no, thanks. He'd head back to the hotel where he would call his wife, Michelle. And he said it as much. He said it straight up in talk radio. This is probably about 5 years ago here in Boston. And he said, look, the guys would say to me, oh, you're no fun. You're so boring. Come on, Danny, have a little bit, live a little. And he'd just say, no, that's fine. And he'd go back to his room and he'd call his wife, Michelle, and check in. And then he'd go to sleep because he's tired. And he would say, over the years, many, many of those men that said I was no fun and I was missing out have called me and said, and he's a gentleman, so he doesn't say names. He said, they've called me and said, Danny, you had it right. You did the right thing. I'm now this many times divorced. I've been arrested for this. I've lost this problem. I've had this alcohol or drug abuse problem. And, you did it right, Danny. That was the way to do it. So I introduced this question of, is Danny Ainge the most masculine man in America? Because according to masculine men, remember that 41% of U.S. adult males who think of themselves as strongly or very masculine, when we ask them in the surveys, as I've done, what their lives are like, what kind of relationships they have, what sorts of aspirations they have for their relationships, pair bonding, meaning finding the love of their life, finding a woman that they can be with who is their best friend, with whom they can have a laugh, someone that they have a shared spiritual and emotional connection with, they say that's more important to them than other men. So, yes, they also say, how much would you describe yourself as aggressive? And I'll share all of this data later as I do more of these videos. But they say, yeah, I'm more aggressive than most. So Danny's definitely more aggressive than most. I mean, you saw it in the video. It's one of the things we loved about him, watching him play when we were kids. But in addition to being more masculine, he is more aggressive as a masculine man. He's also more committed to his loving, now this many decades, wife. He's 10 years older than me, so he's, I think, turned 62 this past year. And, has this very successful marriage and wonderful kids. Now, that's what men who think of themselves as masculine want out of life. Yeah, they want to protect things. They want to aggressively seek the advantages and benefits of life. And they also want to take care of people and provide for them and protect them. And this is one of those things. So in this whole year of me sharing these examples and sharing the data that I'll be sharing with you, I'm trying to wrestle with the fact that in my mind, when I would see people like this on the court, doing this kind of shenanigans, I'd think, oh, these men, they're just so aggressive. They're so masculine, so hyper masculine. And, later someone came up with the term toxic masculinity. Actually, the history of the term toxic masculinity is not what you think. But anyway, let's use it the way we use it today. Toxic masculinity is like, oh, men need to just, get over their aggressiveness and get over their willingness to, tackle someone, in this case, literally tackle someone who is a threat to them and their people, which is what Danny was doing, as well as to his own, ego and self. So I'm not saying that masculine men are just nice. They're not. They're aggressive. But they're also very emotionally committed to their team, their family, their community, and they seek emotional connections. In fact, for today's video, I had promised in my last video that we were going to talk about how much masculine men see themselves as emotional. I ended up spending much of the morning at the clinic looking for a COVID test for one of my kids. Everything's fine here in the home. The kids are isolating in another part of the house. But, I was doing my dad job. And so while I was out there, waiting in line in the cold, it was 17 degrees this morning, waiting outside to get an appointment to take my son to get a COVID test. I'm like, this is what a masculine man does. He takes care of things. He suffers the hour in the 17-degree temperature. And by the way, yeah, he might even say, this isn't that cold. It's not that big of a deal, even as parts of his body stop responding to nerve signals. But that's part of masculinity too. So in this whole project, I've already had people call me. It's like, well, what do you mean? Because isn't masculinity bad? We have been lied to. It is not bad. Oh, sure, the comical version of masculinity that's been presented to us in the media since I was a kid. That comical version, that stereotype, that's bad, obviously. But that's not actually what masculinity is, not according to the men who live masculine lives. And that's what this whole series is about. So in this series, I'm going through questions like, okay, I have never punched anyone in the face. I can't find any survey data. I wish I had asked it. I can't find any survey data that's reliable about how many men, what percent of them have punched someone else in the face. But it doesn't mean I have to go out and punch someone in the face to learn what it's like to be masculine. You notice Danny didn't punch anyone. He tackled Tree, which is interesting. But still, punching people in the face, there's a history of men doing that. So I didn't want to say this out loud because this is so not me. I have a friend who's a boxer, an amateur boxer, and I'm going to reach out to him, and I'm going to see if he's willing to kind of show me what it's like to punch and get hit in the face, of course, with a nice big juicy glove on so that I don't really get hit in the face. I don't want to experience that, actually, because, I'm not that kind of masculine. Anyway, so is Danny Ainge the most masculine man in America? Well, according to this definition, highly aggressive, yes. Highly protective of his people, his team, his family, yes. Highly committed to his long-term partner, absolutely. Masculine men are those men. And let's all see what we can do to become more like them.
Boston Garden. This is the third and deciding game of this night series. The winner to go on to beat Milwaukee. Rollins takes out the frustration of the mascot.